Okay, so once again, this lecture will be put up on our Moodle page, but it'll be later today after everything gets processed. So the first thing is we have talked about the metric system, the SI system. We've talked about US customary system, and I've put some material up about converting back and forth. And so the bottom line and the self-check, as usual, if that takes care of everything that if you're comfortable with it, that's all that you have to do. Aside from that about chapter 4, do you guys have any questions or any of the problems that are bothering you or any particular issues that you'd like me to work with you on? Yes.
I just have a question. So on a couple of questions, it says you can use either system, but then the answers in the book, I've been getting a different answer sometimes, so is that still okay?
If you're on a different set of units, absolutely. If it says you can use a different set of units, and that's a really common thing. You know, a lot of people are just more comfortable working in one set of units or the other. So as long as you are able, when you have a quiz or a test, to use if there's a specified set of units, that's fine. So yeah, absolutely. You won't lose any credit for that. That just kind of shows you know what you're doing. So I appreciate that. Anything else? Any other questions about metric system? Okay. All right. So coming over here, then we are going to take a look at chapter 5, which is our next topic. And we're going to be talking about percents. Okay, so a percent is a different way, and some of you, this is really interesting to me because some people are very fluent in working with percents, especially it seems that people who have worked in retail, if you've ever worked as a wait staff or in retail, a lot of times percents make a lot of sense. But the 5 learning objectives that we have here are to change percents to decimals, to change fractions and decimals to percents, and then to find the base rate and percentage, to use percentage to measure increases and decreases, and to use percents to allocate overhead expenses. So since this is business math, and since many of you are going to go into business for yourself, if you're photographers or an ag business or whatever, this will be stuff that you'll be dealing with, at least to the point where you can get it into an organized fashion so that you know if you're losing money or making money on something. The first piece of the puzzle is to understand what a percent is, okay? And per percent, the word itself actually means of 100, okay? So if you have a whole thing, whatever it is, a pie, for example, you can think of this as being 100%. So 100% means the whole thing, or 1. All right, so if you have half of that, you can say 1/2, or you can express it as a decimal, which is 0.5, which I'll talk about how you do this, or as a percent, which is 50%. So the reason that I wrote these 3 things up on the board is because, can you see this, or is this okay? I was looking at you guys and I was like, maybe this is invisible. But the deal is that any percent can be written as a fraction and can be written as a decimal. And that's actually the first part of this chapter, is to learn how to go back and forth between those different quantities. So how do we do that? Well, if you start with a fraction, let's just start with 1/2 since that's what we're working with. How do we write that as a decimal? Well, your calculator can help you with this. You do not have to do this longhand. But if you take the numerator and divide it by the denominator, so in other words, 1 divided by 2, if you punch that into your calculator, you'll get, or if you do it longhand, you'll get 0.5, okay? So 0.5 is the exact same amount as 1/2. As far as a percent means, like I said, percent means of 100. So to take a decimal and change it to a percent, you multiply it by 100, which gives you 50, and then you make a comment that that is based on 100. So you put the percent sign is just a way of commenting, okay? Now, this number as a percent, when you're doing calculations, you will almost always use either a decimal or a fraction, depending on what is more convenient. Percent is a way of writing something, but it doesn't really go mathematically into an equation, generally speaking. Anytime you have a percent, you need to get rid of the percent sign by essentially dividing that number by 100 is what it amounts to. But any fraction can be written as a decimal, can be written as a percent sign. So sometimes we have fractions that repeat. For example, 1/3. If you do this, you take 1 and divide it by 3, you get 0.333333. It goes on forever, never, never, and never stops. So you can write that as you take the number that repeats and just put a bar over it. That just is a different way of writing this, okay? Or you can write it as a percent by multiplying it by 100, and then you still have that repeating 3, and then you can write the percent sign, okay? So to go backward, if you have a percent like 75%, how do you think you would write that as a decimal?
0.75.
Yes, you divide by 100, and that's how you get the decimal, exactly. So 0.75, and then the next question is, how would you write that as a fraction? Yes, you guys are way ahead of the curve. That's right. If you think about percent, I'm going to go back to the beginning. The answer is absolutely correct. If you take 75%, means 75 out of 100. So it's 75 over 100, and then you can reduce that fraction. So both of these have a common factor of 25. That reduces to 3, and that reduces to 4 if you divide those by 25. All right. So the first part of this chapter talks about just going back and forth between these three. They'll give you a number as a decimal or as a fraction or as a percent, and then you have to go through this process. But the relationship is always the same, right? So that kind of covers really quickly that part. Now, if you look at your textbook, it goes through this entire process the same way, where the first section just talks about changing. Make sure I have everything up there. Yeah, there you go. Make sure that it just goes through the process of changing a percent to a fraction, to a decimal, a percent to a decimal. Now, this is something that can kind of be confusing to some people if you're not used to working with it, is that a percent can be over 100. It just means that it's more than 1. So I may use the example of 175%. If we're talking about a circle like this again, if this is 100%, 175% is just 75 more than that, okay? So you have this, if something is over 100%, it's just like if you have a decimal that's greater than 1, it's exactly the same idea. It's just bigger than 1. That's all that it amounts to. But it's kind of a weird thing. It can be a weird thing to look at because a lot of people are used to looking at decimals that are less than 1 and percents that are less than 1, and also, of course, fractions that are less than 1. Because a fraction is bigger than 1, and we have 5 over 4, that's just an improper fraction. So 5 over 4, similarly, could be written as a decimal, 1.25, which would be a percent of 125%. Okay, so even, it's always move that decimal place 2 places. If going from the left to the right, in other words, multiplying by 100, if you're changing from a decimal to a percent, or dividing by 100, moving the decimal to the left, if you're doing a percent to a decimal. It's also just important to note that when you do this, you write the decimal without any symbol, but when you change it to a percent, you have to get that percent sign in there. So it's important to add it when it becomes a percent, drop it when it becomes a decimal again, okay? All right. So the next part is a little bit interesting. This is where we start working with math of percents or decimals. And like I said, the one thing to remember is very often if you have a percent, before you put it into an equation or a number sentence, you need to change it to a decimal or a fraction before you can operate on it. So here's where we talk about some examples where they talk about, like we says, 80% of $5 is $4. Okay, now before we talk about the number sentence, we'll talk about the number sentence here. 80% of $5 is $4. Okay, the first thing when we have a number sentence or an equation, the word of means multiply, and the word is means equal. Right? So if we need to write this as an equation, we could say 80%. Like I said, we need to get rid of that percent sign before we put it in the equation. So we write it as 0.8 of $5 is $4. Okay, and if you do the math on that, if you take 5 and multiply it by 0.8, you'll see that it's 4. So it all works out. Okay, now when we start talking about numbers in terms of business, we have to recognize some terms, and anytime we have this percent, we call that a rate, right? And then the number that we're talking about, that we're doing something to, that we're operating on, is called the base. And then last but not least, this is the percentage. So another way to write that would be, at a rate of 80%, a base of $5 yields a percent of $4. So, but you need to get that into that working number sentence. Okay, then they just give you a couple of examples where you need to identify the rate, the base, and the percentage. So just remember, the rate corresponds to the number that has a percent sign behind it. The base is the number that you're taking the percent of, and then the percentage is the answer to that equation. Okay. All right. So here's some ideas about when we use percentages in business, and to write general forms of this number sentence. We already talked about this, but we can also say, if we talk about P as being the percentage, in other words, we're just getting some variables set up here, and B as being the base, and R as being the rate. Okay, whenever we have write a number sentence, we can see that the rate multiplied by the base is equal to the percent. Okay, so this always works after you define what those three things are. The other thing you can say is that the rate is equal to the percent divided by the base, and the base is equal to the percent divided by the rate. Now, if any of you're not required to have algebra to be in this class, but if you've had algebra, you'll know where that comes from. But basically, if you just have these three forms of that equation, then you can work out these kind of problems as long as you can define which is the percent, which is the base, and which is the rate. And one thing I want to point out here is when we talk about rates, once again, if you look right here, when we put it into that equation, we have to change 15% to the decimal of 0.15, just because that's what your calculator will respond to, and that's how the math works out. So you never want to put in 15. Oops, I've got some colors up on the board, didn't I? Get rid of that. There we go. All right. So there we go. Okay, now this is something that can also be a little bit confusing, but we can talk about percents as measuring change. So for example, if you have to spend $4 this year to get a cup of coffee and next year it's $5, you spent $1 more, right? That means that $1 is, you have a $1 increase. And what percent is that? Well, the first thing is you always measure an increase of the base. Okay, so if you say Coffee last year was $4. That's going to be your base. Coffee now is $5. Okay, $5 is not the increase, is it? The difference between them, $1 is the increase. And then what percent is that? The answer is it's $1 divided by $4 or 0.25, which is a 25% increase. Okay, so you just want to make a point of it is you have to make that based on the $4. You're not basing it on the $5, which is the new cost, right? So the increase is based on what the old cost was. Same with the decrease. If you, boy, I don't know anything that's gone down in price, but if you said last year I had 5 notebooks and this year I have 4 notebooks, okay? That means that your base is $5 and the decrease is 5 minus 4 or 1. So that means that my decrease is 1/5, which turns out to be 0.2 or 20%. Okay, and it's because of what the base is. You always think backward in time, where you started. Okay, if you started with 5, the bottom number in that equation is 5. If you started with 4, the bottom number is 4. Okay. All right. And the similar stuff, when we're allocating overhead expenses, what we're talking about here is when you set up a business, there are certain costs that you have that aren't really, they're kind of, well, they're not always fixed costs, but they're associated with just doing business. Like if you have an office that you're renting or a studio that you're renting, you're gonna have to rent that studio as long as you're in business, right? So you can distribute it among your clients, but if you don't have a certain number of clients, you still have to pay the same amount of rent. So that's kind of what we're talking about there. So here we're talking about floor space and distributing a cost of rent based on floor space, okay? So this is just a different way of thinking about percentages. It's one more way to apply those ideas. All right, so those are some of those terms that we talked about. We didn't really talk about allocate. We talked about amounts of increase and decrease. We talked about base. We talked about overhead cost, percentages, rates of decrease, and rates of increase. So when we talk about allocate, what we're talking about is if you have that fixed cost and you have 4 clients, you have to divide it among all 4 of them to think about how much it's costing. If you have 11 clients, you divide it among those 11s. So allocate means to assign representative proportions of a business to the different departments of the company. So, or to different people, different clients or whatever, but just giving it proportionally. So it's just another way of using percents. So at this point, you guys have any questions? Okay. So I always do these speed lectures because then I want to put them up on Moodle so that everybody will have everything. And I assume that if something's sticky for you, that you can go back and take a look at a particular thing. But I kind of want to get everything in one shot, especially after I recorded 2 chapters on the same lecture, which was not a very smart thing to do. But so my goal now is to not do that again. But today, that's it for the lecture. If you'd like to see on work on your homework, I will be here. I do have an extra copy of the book. If you want to privately go over your quiz with me, we can do that. If you're done with chapter 5 and you wish to go get a $5 coffee, you can do that as well. So, or whatever it is these days. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the camera. She says she is anyway. There you are.